This is John Davis, and along with my colleague, Mark Russo, this is the Everstream Analytics 5-minute forecast. If we look at the major disruptions going forward this week across North America, we do have two areas that will tend to see overall disruptions. One in the southern U.S. due to severe weather, Texas to the southeast, and another one in the Pacific Northwest. And that is exemplified in this chart, which overall looks at the major airports and the airports that are at high risk during this week's time frame. We have three major cargo airports: Seattle, Tacoma, Dallas, and Atlanta, that are scoring high risk due to these various weather events across those locales. As for the major port operations, we have three major ports, all in the Pacific Northwest, that are scoring high risk: Vancouver, Seattle, and Tacoma. And finally, in the intermodal hub network, we have 17 intermodal hubs that are scoring high risk. Most of that is due to strong winds, snow, and heavy rain across the Pacific Northwest and coastal areas of British Columbia. Let's take an in-depth look at the two weather situations this week. First of all, we'll take a look at the severe weather risk across the southern U.S. The setup this week is very similar to the last couple of weeks. It's the far southern U.S. that is going to be the area that is at higher risk of severe weather, possibly tornadoes, strong thunderstorms, hail, heavy downbursts of rain. And the timing of this will be today and tonight across Texas and Louisiana. Then that system shifts eastward on Tuesday and Wednesday across areas of the lower Mississippi Valley and into the southeast portion of the country. So it is the next 3 days where we'll tend to see the potential for disruptions across the far southern portion of the country. As we look at the broader kind of wind gusts out there, we have two areas coming up that will tend to see the highest wind gusts. The Plains and Rockies will tend to be very windy over the next couple of days, likely some issues there. And also off the west coast of the North America with a very strong storm moving into areas of British Columbia and also into the Pacific Northwest. That storm system will tend to cause heavy snowfall across that zone, and that is the area where we will tend to see some disruptions from a heavy snow standpoint and very strong winds across the mountainous terrain of the Pacific Northwest and Washington and Oregon, and also up into the higher terrain of British Columbia. So all in all this week, we have two areas of note: the southern U.S. with severe weather, that's the next 3 days, and then over the next couple of days also in the Pacific Northwest and into areas of British Columbia. Now let's go on to some of the global highlights with Mark.
Thanks, John. As we look around the world here for this week, there are some regional highlights here. First, we're going to cover Europe, where in Europe, we are tracking two major ports that are scoring high risk. That includes the ports of Rotterdam and Antwerp. Also, from a maritime choke points standpoint, we are tracking three choke points scoring high risk, including the Strait of Dover, Danish Straits, and Strait of Gibraltar. This week, we'll still see some lingering colder than normal temperatures and some stormy conditions across Europe. And so the main threat with these overall ports and maritime choke points are due to stronger winds. So let's take a closer look at one of the key supply chain nodes, and that's the port of Rotterdam, where there are two periods of medium or high risk of disruptions due to wind, one of which here is today on Monday, and then the second time frame is coming up primarily on Wednesday, when maximum wind speeds do look to exceed 60, even potentially over 80 kilometers per hour. And again, that's enough to cause disruptions with vessel movement at the port, as well as potential for even some closure for several hours. Winds do look to subside here coming up later on this week, and that will result in an overall lowering of the risk at the port of Rotterdam. Looking elsewhere around the world, in East Asia, certainly some medium to high risk at a few localized ports and choke points. Those include the Soya Strait maritime choke point in northern Japan, but then also the major port of Lianggang in eastern China, and that is due to the forecast of stronger wind gusts here coming up here this week, in particular on Wednesday in eastern China. That is where winds look to be the strongest and the highest potential for some localized disruptions there at the port of Lianyungang. Finally, we do want to highlight the increased risk of disruptions to mining operations in New Caledonia. Now, Eastern Australia and New Zealand supply chain hubs are at basically low risk here for this week. But in New Caledonia, there is the high risk of potential flooding, which again could impact mining operations. That is due to Tropical Cyclone 23, which looks to stay a weak cyclone, but track just west of New Caledonia. However, the biggest impact is going to be from heavy rainfall and flooding, where forecast rainfall totals look to exceed over 150 millimeters, even some areas in the western part of the country over 300 millimeters. And that's enough to cause significant flooding, enough to cause disruptions to operations there, as well as transportation. Now, New Caledonia does produce approximately 10% of the world's nickel supply, which is also used in electric vehicle batteries. So certainly a key sourcing area here for materials. And again, any supply chain networks in New Caledonia need to prepare for this potential high impact event here coming up here for this week. For more details on these risks to your supply chain networks and operations, please log into your Everstream account. And thank you for watching today's 5-minute forecast. Get in front of what's ahead.